It's that time of the year again. It's time to give our money to Gabe, and today we're talking about strategy games. Ones that you can really play with your friends. Now, these games have single-player content, they have online multiplayer offerings. We're just going to be diving into it right here with games I strongly recommend you play with your friends, and once you're done with that, you have some custom content you can get right into to keep the game fresh. So let's start it off with the Company of Heroes franchise. This is a World War II RTS series with a focus on squad-based micromanagement. Rather than commanding one unit at a time, you command a full squad. You've also got artillery, tanks, and other types of units. Tanks control like actual tanks. They don't turn on the dime like other RTS games, at least for the second game. So right off the bat, if you're going to be playing the multiplayer or the multiplayer with friends only, Company of Heroes 2 is your best bet. It's got the bigger player base, and the engine is significantly improved over the first. What isn't improved is the selection of custom content and the single-player campaign. Seriously, Company of Heroes 1 annihilates Company of Heroes 2 in those areas. COH1 has more campaigns and better ones at that, including one where you play as the Germans, 2 of them in fact I think, being one of the few games where you can actually do that, which is pretty interesting. The custom content is way more expansive too. COH2 has some decent custom content in the form of new maps and an overhaul here and there to change up the game, but for the most part, COH1 is the better game in that sense, but I still recommend COH2 because of the engine improvements to that game. COH2 has its share of bugs still, but COH1 has a mountain of issues by comparison. Collision being a big problem. I cannot tell you how many times things have gotten stuck or bugged out back when I played it a lot. You're also going to need to add some command line options to the Steam version to get it working properly, otherwise it might be locked at 24 FPS when you play it. There's a lot of bugs from it being just a very old game in general on modern systems. Gameplay isn't as responsive either. Now, as for modding, again, every game on this list, you're going to have fun playing the vanilla game, and then once you burn out on it, then you can move on to mods. Both games here use the Steam Workshop to mod, which is very easy to do, but for the more expansive mods, you're going to have to go on the third-party sites like mod.db. Now, the base game for COH2 is available for $5, but I'd instead ignore everything on this store page and just get the multiplayer bundle. This includes the base game of Company of Heroes 2, which includes 2 factions for multiplayer, comes with the Russians and the German Wehrmacht, but if you get the complete pack, you also get the German Oberkommando West faction, the Americans, and the British faction. These factions play very different from each other, so I'd highly recommend getting all of them in a bundle to really get a sense of what you want to play, and it's really worth that price currently. Company of Heroes 1 is also discounted, but Jesus, they're still asking close to $10 on sale for the full base game plus expansions. It's a good value still, but I remember paying that much years ago, maybe even less. If you do buy Company of Heroes 1, make sure you're launching the correct version and not the Legacy Edition or any of the expansions. It should just be called Company of Heroes 1 in your library, and it'll launch with all the game content, expansions, and updates. The game used to use GameSpy online services, and now it uses Steamworks instead, so it's easy to connect with your friends. And because of that decision, I guess they decided to split the game into 2 different versions or executables. When you buy the game now, just make sure you run the right version. Company of Heroes 2 works fine, but it does have a beta 64-bit mode option that runs better, but the online servers for the 32 and 64-bit versions seem to be separate, which is just ridiculous, to be frank. If you're trying to run the game in 64-bit mode, you won't be able to find games online. Bear in mind that both Company of Heroes 1 and 2 are designed for either 1v1 or team-based gameplay. So if you're playing with 3 friends, you're gonna have an issue unless one of you is fine with teaming up with an AI, and I wouldn't recommend that because the AI in this game is terrible. Expert AI flat out cheats, and anything below is brain dead. Company of Heroes 1 also requires everyone on one team to play allies and the other to play Axis. You can't mix and match or mirror in Company of Heroes 1. For custom games, you can do that in Company of Heroes 2 though, but again, you still have to do team-based gameplay or a 1v1. For COH1, I'd check out the Blitzkrieg mod once you're tired of the base game. That mod is massive and expansive. And COH2 has the Spearhead mod, which is pretty nice. Pretty good value overall for COH2. I recommend getting that one for the multiplayer. If you really did Company of Heroes 2, you might like to try Company of Heroes 1 and its expansions and single-player offerings. I wouldn't bother with the campaign for COH2, though. It's not very good. Star Wars Empire at War. Pretty cheap right here, under $10. This game not too long ago got Steamworks support, so it's moved from GameSpy, which is great because I can easily recommend it now. Well, mostly. It's a Star Wars game set in the Galactic Civil War era, but that won't stop modders from adding in all kinds of EU elements, including Thrawn or Clone Wars stuff. And since the game was always a very easy affair to mod, it's also adopted the Steam Workshop system, much like Company of Heroes 2, and it's so easy to mod it now. Anyway, Empire at War is a bit of a mixed bag. On the single-player side, you've got the base game, which features an Imperial and Rebel campaign. You've got the Forces of Corruption expansion, which is where all the multiplayer and custom content is. This includes what you'd expect from an expansion, that being new features and content for the existing factions, a new faction called the Zon Consortium, and you also get the new Zon Consortium campaign. No new Rebel or Imperial campaign, though, unfortunately, for the expansion. And the campaign mission-to-mission for both the base game and the expansion campaign are a bit hit or miss, but we're here to talk about the multiplayer component, and for this game, it has a lot going on. You've got space battles, land battles, and a 4x light mixture of both through the Galactic Conquest campaign map, which is 1v1 only, but you can do skirmish, land, and space battles with more players, and you've also got the option for a free-for-all 3-player modes, which is nice. You can also have 3 teams going on at once rather than the restrictive 2 teams of Company of Heroes 2. AI is alright in this one because the combat isn't super complicated. Space battles are where it's at. Ground battles aren't very good. That's partly due to the engine. There's some collision issues, and sometimes units get stuck, especially if you use the game's increased speed option. It's not great. This is one of the easier strategy games to get into, but it's still quite simple because of that. There's a nice spectacle to it, though. There's a nice cinematic mode you can enable by hitting the spacebar. It's really cool. I also hear you can maybe have more players in the Galactic Conquest mode through the modding system, but don't quote me on that. Overall, it's a pretty good game for the multiplayer, and the modding scene is extremely extensive, as you'd imagine for it being a Star Wars game that launched with modding tools. I'd check out the Thrawn's Revenge and the Republic at War mods. Huge expansion of content. Just bear in mind that the game itself is quite old and already has a problem or two potentially running on newer hardware, and modding it can add more instability. Not necessarily the modder's fault, it's the game's engine, but regardless, it's still worth checking out. Dawn of War, Soulstorm, and the Master Collection. Holy hell, this is so goddamn cheap. You gotta get this. Okay, there's a lot on this page, so let me break it down. There's a franchise bundle for the Dawn of War games. There's Dawn of War 1, 2, and 3. Now, I'm going to recommend Dawn of War 1, and specifically, I'm going to recommend Soulstorm, okay? So, this is going to get a little interesting, but just bear with me right here. So, Dawn of War 1, 2, and 3 are quite different games. Dawn of War 1 is actually a proper RTS. Dawn of War 2 is more like an action RPG. Dawn of War 3 was supposed to be a good mix of 1 and 2, when it was going to come out. At least that's what people thought, and it ended up being some weird MOBA RTS thing. It's not a very good game, and they cut support of it very short, unlike the previous games, so don't get Dawn of War 3. Dawn of War 2, maybe check it out, but Dawn of War 1 is the one I'm talking about today. So Dawn of War 1 has been taken off GameSpy and now plays via Steamworks, which is great, so it's easy to play with your friends. Sadly, no workshop support, so you gotta get your mods from places like mod.db. As for the deal, I'm really recommending one game here, or more specifically, one expansion to play, and for you to buy that game's surrounding expansion. So what you want here is the Dawn of War Master Collection for under $6, okay? You don't want just Soulstorm. You have the base game, Dawn of War, which takes place in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and features 4 factions. The Space Marines, the Eldar, the Chaos Space Marines, and the Orcs. But it gets better, because the game has 3 expansions in that little collection. Winter Assault adds the Imperial Guard faction, Dark Crusade adds the Tau and Necron factions, and Soulstorm, which is the one you want for playing and modding, adds everything the expansions added over time, which includes the extra units and maps, but it also has its own factions, that being the Sisters of Battle and the Dark Eldar factions, and of course, more units for the other factions, more maps, and the addition of aerial units. But you don't get all the factions if you just buy Soulstorm, all the base factions. Soulstorm is the game you want to actually launch and play, but you also want the other expansions and the base game because you need them on your Steam account to unlock those other factions, you know, the Imperial Guard, the Space Marines. Because otherwise you're going to be just playing with the Dark Eldar and the Sisters of Battle, and they're okay, but you really want the full selection of factions, and doing all that lets you mod it to your heart's content. The modding scene for this game is insane, as you'd expect from Warhammer 40k, of course. The Unification mod is becoming the most popular right now, thanks to a slew of updates. It adds a ton of new factions, maps, units, all that good stuff. But if you really want to dial the game up to 11 and then some, you want the Apocalypse mod. Is it balanced? No. Is it buggy as shit? Yes. Is it a pain in the ass to install? Yes. Is it one of the most insane things I've ever played, and you should absolutely play it? Yes, yes, yes. You will never understand the feeling of nuking someone's base and watching them completely melt down until you've played this. It's amazing. Even without mods, you're getting 7 extremely robust factions and a ton of maps and content. You've even got full-on army painter, which is just crazy. You've also got the campaigns, which vary a bit. The base game and the first expansion have pretty good story-driven campaigns. Dark Crusade kind of changes things up and does a grand strategy campaign map instead for its campaign, a little less narrative-driven than the previous games. Soulstorm is arguably the weakest campaign here because it was made by a different studio, and yes, for those aware, it does contain the infamous "Our enemies hide in metal boxes" line. But you will get your fill of single-player content somewhere among all of these games. The games are quite similar to Company of Heroes in many respects, partly because it was made by the same developer, but I have fewer issues with Dawn of War's engine than with the first Company of Heroes game. Of course, that gets a little bit different when you mod it. For the most part, lately, the mods have been pretty good stability-wise, and you're going to want to launch and mod Soulstorm exclusively once you have the full pack. This is an insane value. It doesn't even get this cheap on like third-party key sites. It's normally like $10. Under $6, holy crap, buy this. So for our last game, we have Sins of a Solar Empire Rebellion. Right, so this is a bit more recent. I picked this game up with my friends about a week ago, and I've put over 20 hours into it already among like, I think 4-5 games. This would be a good time to mention that I also have a combined 500 hours between all of these games I've listed, so I've played them quite a bit. I also play all 4 of these games nowadays via the same people from the podcast, so that's Noah, Joseph, and Dean. Joseph and Dean don't play RTS unless they're in a group. Noah might play one on his own if he digs it, and I go out of my way to play strategy games, whether that be campaign or competitively online, if they're any good. Every one of us picked up each game on this list fairly well. We all got into it. We have a varying degree of skill when it comes to strategy games and interest. But for Sins, despite how this game looks a little complicated, everyone picked it up really fast, and we all really enjoy it so far, despite it being a 4X grand strategy game, which is something I tend to stay away from. Don't be discouraged about it looking a little complicated here. This game is surprisingly easy to learn. Sins of a Solar Empire Rebellion is a sci-fi standalone expansion. It has much of the same content of the previous game, but with more features, more maps, the new Titan units. This game is a mixture of economy management and big spaceship battles. Seriously, if you were ever playing a space RTS skirmish and thought, man, I wish we could have a bunch of players fighting each other across star systems in real time all at once, and I could build up my planets with defenses, and I could retreat my units to them if things got too hairy and I'd like to trade with other factions, or bribe pirates to attack my friends, I'd like to do some backstabbing to keep everyone on their toes, maybe ally with some people. Well, this game is all that and a lot more. Gameplay is in many ways similar to Supreme Commander if you've ever played it. The RTS combat is probably the weakest aspect though. There is some micromanagement, but this is by and large a macro RTS. So this makes it extremely easy for people who don't like RTS to enjoy, but I still like it because it has enough depth to keep me hooked for hours. And I barely even touched the tutorials. I was able to get into this game, look up a couple things online, and then be like, okay, I'm pretty much set. I just need to get experience from playing a few games. And we've been doing that for the most part, and we've been having a lot of fun. Games tend to be a minimum 3 hours long though, and most of our games go to like the 5-hour mark. Although that's because we're still learning it. Partly, it also is a pretty big game. It has a few problems. The engine is kind of old. We did experience crashes, but the game does have an autosave system, a very good one, and a manual save system, which is very useful. The DLC for the game doesn't add much, but it's nice to have. I get it on sale. From what I hear, only the host needs to own the DLC for others, which is great if true. That means one person buys the DLC, everyone joins in, and that's it. The modding community for this game is ridiculous. I haven't gotten into it yet, but I've seen some great total conversion mods, mainly for Star Trek, Halo, and Star Wars being very highly regarded. Now, as for the deal itself, it's honestly not great. For a 10-year-old game by this point, you'd expect it to be a little cheaper, and the Ultimate Edition just tries to bundle in stuff you don't need. $7.50 worth of stuff. That's the soundtrack and the original game, which is just Sins of a Solar Empire Trinity, which is not what you want to play. You want Rebellion. I'd say the DLC is partly worth it because it does add a few more maps, a little bit of extra content, And of course, it's good to have all the base DLC so that you can really get into the modding scene without any issues at all. As for how the modding scene works, I'm not sure. Again, I do recommend checking out that Star Trek Armada mod, but, I haven't played it yet, but from what I've seen, it looks pretty good, really well detailed. Sin's Rebellion is a bit old at this point, but it still looks good, and you can improve it with mods or through the options menu. I strongly recommend going to the user interface settings menu and increasing the UI scaling immediately so that the interface is readable by beings other than ants. Yeah, it's old, but it's gold, much like everything else on this list. Alright guys, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. If you guys want a definitive list of strategy games I've already covered but I haven't talked about yet, I have a lot of other game recommendations. I don't like recommending the same game twice, so what I will do is I will leave a link in the description for the Steam Curator page. You can check out all the games I've recommended, or not recommended, on that page, and you can make some decisions for the Steam sale this holiday season. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. I'm out.